Welcome to the video. Today we're taking a look at how you can utilize the Microsoft Graph API using C#. We're going to cover the whole process from creating an enterprise application in the admin center to finding the permissions and calls you'll need to make in your application. In case you only need information about one of the topics, I've left some timestamps in the description. To utilize the Graph SDK, we'll need two NuGet packages. The first one being Microsoft.graph or Microsoft.graph.beta, the second one being Azure.identity. These two packages will allow us easy access to the different calls we'll make and all the models we'll need. In a new project, I've created a class and I'm going to create a property for a Graph service client. This will be the client we use to make the calls to the API. Then I'm going to create a constructor where we'll take in a tenant ID, a client ID, and a client secret. Using these three variables, we can create a Graph service client. So we'll assign Graph client to a method called createGraphClient and pass in the variables. Next up, we'll create the actual method. Then we'll create a variable for the token credential options. Here we can define the retry options, but more importantly, this is where we will define the authority host. Normally, we'll set the authority host here to Azure Authority Hosts.Azure Public Cloud. But in case you live in Germany, China, or if you're using a government tenant, this will need to be adjusted accordingly. Now we can create a client secret credential, pass in the tenant ID, client secret, and the token credential options. The only thing left before creating the Graph service client is defining the scopes. If you're using a certificate or client secret, as we are in this video, the scopes will always be an array of strings with the URL graph.microsoft.com/.default. If you're creating an application where you only need access to the signed-in user, you would use the authorization code flow instead, and would here define the specific permissions your application uses. I'll leave a link to the documentation in the description for that part. Then, at last, we can return a new Graph service client where we pass in the client secret credentials and the scopes. To make a call, we'll create a new method. Let's make it a public async task with a return type of user. Name it getUser and have it accept a string called user principal name. Then we can return await graph client that uses. Inside square brackets, we can pass in the user principal name and then call getAsync on it. Once everything is set up, that's how easily we can make the calls using the SDK. Let me show you a different example. Here we want to get a list of all our SharePoint sites. So we create a variable to store the sites from the API call and we assign it to await graph client.sites.getAllSites.getAsync. This will give us a getAllSites response. We want the value of it. Below here, I have a bit of logic to sort the response since it will give us both SharePoint and OneDrive sites. And we might only want one of them. This will be quite a typical way of dealing with the SDK. We make a call, we clean up the responses we get for what we need. Now let's talk about how to figure out what calls you need to make to get the information you need. In case you want calls made from Azure Active Directory or from the Intune portal, you can use an extension made by Merrill. This extension is called Graph X-Ray, and once installed allows you to press F12 if you're using Chrome, and then you can click on the More tabs button where you'll find it. Here you can then pick a language of your choosing and then browse around the Intune or Azure Active Directory portals, and it will tell you what calls are being made to Graph. This is extremely useful because Microsoft themselves use the Graph API. Just beware that they're using the Beta API. But in case you want something outside of these two portals, Google is most often your friend, and you should be able to Google, for example, let's say SharePoint site Graph API and find what you need in the official documentation. So let's say you know what call you want to make. We need to make sure we know what permissions this call will need. You can either find the permissions using the official documentation. Say you did Google SharePoint Graph API. The official documentation will list the permissions that can give you access to said resources. Another way would be to use the Graph Permissions tool Merrill also made. I'll leave a link in the description to this as well. A third way would be to use the official Graph Explorer. If you type in the request URL here and click on Modify Permissions, it will give you a list of the permissions this resource needs. By now you have some code, you know what calls to make, and you know what permissions they need. But now you need the tenant ID, and client secret we needed in the code part. So first up, you need to be an application administrator or a global admin in your tenant. Otherwise you will need one to accept the permissions for the application later on. So head over to your Microsoft Admin Center. In the left side, we can click on Show All and click on Identity, which will take us to the Enter portal. This next part can also be done from the old Azure Active Directory portal in case you're using that instead. So once we're here, we want to click on Applications, then App Registrations and create a new one. We'll give it a meaningful name and choose the supported account types. The things I've shown in this video are primarily targeted towards single tenant. In case you're interested in multi-tenant applications, let me know in the comments below and I'll make a video on that. The redirect URL here is also used for multi-tenant applications and for the authorization code flow I briefly mentioned earlier. So for the sake of this video, I'll leave it empty and click on register. Once we've done so, you can see the client ID and tenant ID. So let's click on certificates and secrets on the left here. And here we can name and create our secret. Take note of the expiry date though. When creating the secret using the web interface, it can be a maximum of 24 months. We can, however, create it using PowerShell instead and make it last up to 99 years. I'll post a command for that in the description. Now make sure you copy the secret, as you can only see it this one time. If you lose it, you'll need to create a new one. The last thing we need now is to set up the permissions for the applications. For the two calls I showed earlier, we'll need two application permissions since we aren't using an authorization code flow. The first one being user.read.all and the second one being sites.read.all. Make sure to always add the least privileged permission you need. So now we can take the tenant ID, and client secret and see if everything works properly. In a real project, you obviously want to store the secret securely. As you can see, we here get a user object and we get a list of all the SharePoint sites in this specific tenant. So that concludes our brief introduction to using the Graph SDK with C#. Let me know if you had any issues or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.